Amazon presents Yancey versus Dorm Hall Bathroom. Some bathrooms offer quaint amenities. The Dorm Hall bathroom offers a level 7 airborne virus for your feet. But Yancey shopped on Amazon and saved on shower sandals, oversized bath towels, and antibacterial body soap. His opponent played dirty, but Yancey kept it clean. Save the everyday with college deals on Amazon.
And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I want to talk about Vietnam. I want to talk about Vietnam during the Second World War and the kind of the wider contextual picture to the events that follow the Second World War, and really why it is that we have the kind of the crises that engulf the French Empire in Vietnam, the way that they do, and the national liberation movement that emerges. So we're looking at Max Hastings. His book All Hell Let Loose is kind of a good general reader on the Second World War. If you're asking, I prefer as a general reader Anthony Beevor's The Second World War. It's pretty much a indispensable volume, and I do quite like Anthony Beevor's analysis. Very kind of objective, his view of things. Max Hastings writes, the European overseas empires were riven by divisions, which became more acute when colonies were subjected to occupation. In Indochina, through a variety of complex anomalies, the French flag continued to fly until March 1945. A Vichy regime led by Admiral Jean Decaux administered the country in accordance with the orders of a Japanese military mission. In September 1940, Japanese troops emphasized their absolute dominance by attacking 2 Tonkinese towns and killing 800 French troops before withdrawing into southern China. The confusion of local loyalties intensified when Vichy warships fought a series of actions against the neighbouring Siamese, modern-day Thailand, who attempted to secure a disputed border territory in Laos and Cambodia. The Japanese intervened to enforce a French retreat and to secure the interests of their Siamese clients. From July 1941 onwards, 35,000 Japanese troops acted as they chose in Indochina, which was incorporated in Japan's so-called Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the Japanese empire in Asia. The Vichy Vichy colonists, preserved shreds of personal freedom as long as they, like European acolytes of the Nazis, implemented the policies of their Axis masters. In March 1945, on the orders from liberated Paris, French troops launched a disastrous uprising, quickly and brutally suppressed by the Japanese, who then assumed full control of the country. So, the the abiding feeling of post-war France and its colonies was one of humiliation, of the national shame, firstly, of the German occupation of France, and then the Japanese occupation of France's prize Asian colony, Vietnam, and the Vichy collaboration in places like Algeria. In the French Empire undergoes essentially a civil war between Free French and Vichy forces, and many wars are fought by them in Syria, and obviously in France itself. And the humiliation again of white colonizers, French white colonizers, to be coerced, not by Vietnamese, but by Japanese, by Asians, and then at the end of the Second World War, to be liberated by the British, which is, for any even the Free French, even the Gaullists would have found that intolerable, and the internment camps that some French were crowded into, or the French civilians and soldiers were crowded into, their gates were finally opened, not even by white British soldiers, but by Indian ones. And if you set yourself, I mean, if it's not a pleasant task, but if you place yourself in the mindset of the French white racial colonizer of Asia, French colons who had grown up in Vietnam, who viewed themselves, they would have called themselves, French Vietnamese, and viewed themselves as the kind of almost sort of the white indigenous people of Vietnam, as kind of colonizers have wont to do. The series of humiliations meted out upon them gives you a clue about the determination of colonial settlers to hang on after 1945. And it was after 1945 the colonial regime in Vietnam, the restored French colonial regime in Vietnam, that was most up for a fight to suppress the national liberation movement, the Vietminh, and most aggressively violent towards them. The Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians suffered appallingly from 1942 onwards. The stat that Harper and Bailey always point out in Forgotten Wars and Forgotten Armies is that the thing we remember in terms of the crimes of the Japanese are the British soldiers and the Aussie diggers and the Kiwis the American. Let's not forget American downed airmen as well on the Burma Road. Bridge on the River Kwai. We know, of course, the way in which French colonists and soldiers and the Dutch were treated by the Japanese as well. You take all of that, put all of that together, and that is 1% of Japan's murders. Basically, I think something like 15,000. I'll check the stats, but 15,000 Allied servicemen, POWs, were murdered or worked to death or died of preventable diseases. 1% of the killings by the Japanese of non-combatants. So the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians suffered appallingly from 1942 onwards as the Japanese pillaged their countries. Elderly Vietnamese later said that their experiences were worse than those of the later wars of independence, so against the Americans and the French. Rice, corn, coal, and rubber were shipped to Japan. Many rice fields were compulsorily planted with jute and cotton to meet the occupiers' textile requirements. This, of course, was the thing that had caused famines in India by the British. Denied their own produce, and there is a famine at the end of the Second World War in North Vietnam. Denied their own produce, local people began to starve on a staggering scale. In Tonkin, by 1945, at least 1.5 million Vietnamese, and perhaps many more, had died of hunger in a country which before the war was the world's third largest grower of rice. The French colonial authorities suppressed local protests with insurrections with a brutality the Japanese could not have surpassed. The Communist Vietminh movement was the chief political beneficiary of the Vietnamese misery, gaining substantial support in northern areas where Tokyo's policies caused most distress. There was no significant armed resistance to the Japanese until the summer of 1945, because the passionately anti-imperialist Americans refused to fly free French officers into Vietnam from China. Only in the summer of that year did the OSS ship arms to the Vietminh in a belated attempt to foment anti-Japanese activity. The weapons were warmly welcomed by their leader, Win Ai Kwok, better known as Ho Chi Minh. OSS officers, this is the Office of Strategic Services, the former of the CIA, on the ground displayed an unreserved enthusiasm for his guerrillas, epic naivety about their politics, and a bitter animosity towards the French colonialists. The anti-French sentiment that Roosevelt had, and that Truman later joined him, is really, really quite interesting. I mean, obviously, de Gaulle was a very difficult guy to deal with, and had pushed relations with British and the Americans to kind of breaking point. He was almost implying in 1944 that they wanted the British and the French out of France as quickly as possible once the Germans had been kicked out, because de Gaulle suspected that some kind of Anglo-Saxon takeover of France was about to happen, and that this was a kind of a part of how it was likely to go down. So it's very difficult guy to deal with, and Roosevelt always suspected that he had it in him to be a dictator. Well, the events of the late 1960s would point to that in his kind of dying years. But the thing about the lack of the lack of rapport with the French, it runs kind of deeper than that. There were deep suspicions. There's all sorts of interesting kind of oral histories of soldiers on D-Day going ashore, thinking that the French were the local French might well really be in cahoots with the Nazis. And there's all sorts of kind of misgivings there, obviously, wildly unrealistic. But the fact that in 1944 so much of the fighting was done on French soil, and thousands and thousands of French civilians died, particularly in the Battle of Normandy, it left significant bad blood. But also there was this kind of uneasy relationship. That Roosevelt was far more sympathetic towards Stalin, a bona fide dictator, than he was to de Gaulle. It's very interesting to read about the kind of the fact that the OSS were arming the Vietminh, and they were arming them ostensibly to fight the Japanese. But I strongly believe that they were arming them to fight the French as well. And the view that the kind of the Rooseveltian Democrats took at the time was that it was time to really finish off Woodrow Wilson's work, and not to allow European empires to re-establish themselves in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That a world free of European empires was going to be a much better world. Roosevelt saw it being a four-power world. The British he wasn't going to call it an empire, but he considered a sphere of influence. The Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans. There would be no place for the French. And the part of the sentiment at the Allied conferences is that the French had hardly covered themselves in glory and hardly deserved really any of the spoils of war. Roosevelt obviously dies in April 1945, and the world that he'd envisaged, this four-power world, doesn't emerge. In fact, a much more unstable two-power world emerges in the guise of the Cold War. And this, in a way, is what changes American policy towards Vietnam. This makes the world a far more unstable affair, and Vietnam far more significantly important. And also, then in 1949, the crisis year for Truman's administration. Not only is it discovered that the Soviets have detonated their first atomic bomb, but also that China goes communist. And then an anti-communist cordon sanitaire around China becomes really, really important. And you already have the first pieces: Japan, occupied by America, Korea, South Korea, an American ally, soon to be the forefront of the Korean War, Taiwan, occupied by the KMT, the Kuomintang, and again, an American protectorate, Hong Kong, a British base, a safe port for the US Pacific Fleet. When I lived there in the 1980s, when you looked out through the bedroom window twice a year down at the harbour, what should be steaming in but American aircraft carriers. And then the cordon sanitaire in the east is Pakistan, and at the time, to a degree, Afghanistan, and also then building that cordon sanitaire would be South Vietnam. And Vietnam, the domino theorists believed, was how China could break the stranglehold. And from 1954 onwards, the Americans become more and more concerned that the one force in the world is much more dangerous than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union can be kind of controlled to some extent, can be managed to some extent, but you have in Mao's China something much more dangerous, much more unpredictable. And and as the French defeat in Dien Bien Phu shows, the withdrawal from Vietnam by the French is hastened with Chinese help. The North Vietnamese become a serious fighting force with Chinese help, Chinese artillery, Chinese rockets, and Chinese training and infantry tactics. The French, in their expeditionary missions into the north, fail to realise that they're dealing with a much more serious opponent. I did do a podcast on this a few years ago now. I'm going to try to kind of organise all these things. It's from Martin Thomas's brilliant book Fight or Flight, which I'll have talked about loads. And it talked about how Chinese help, which was always warily received by the Vietnamese, very warily. They've been fighting China for a millennia or more, and it was always important to be healthily suspicious of the Chinese. But Chinese help tipped the balance away from the French. Also, the French, the rather daft decision to build their military outpost in a valley where they can be shelled into surrender at Dien Bien Phu. So I'll read a bit more from Max Hastings. The Vietminh, by that time numbering over 5,000 active supporters, were happy to fight the French, but showed no interest in engaging the Japanese. They either stored their weapons in readiness for the post-war independence struggle, or brandished them to impose their will on the rural population. Under pressure from Washington, the OSS persuaded the guerrillas to make some show of engaging the occupiers. One group staged a noisy demonstration against a small Japanese supply column, which turned and fled without suffering much harm. On another occasion, on the 17th of July 1945, a Vietminh battalion led by Voi Nguyen Giap, who of later Vietnam War fame, attacked a Japanese outpost at Tam Dua, killing 8 of its 40 defenders and capturing the remainder. But this appears to have been the some Vietminh contribution to the Allied cause. in return for US deliveries of several tons of weapons and equipment, which were later used against the returning French colonialists. You have to remember that the returning French colonialists, their view of how things would be in Vietnam was not dissimilar to the way kind of the white regime in South Africa or Rhodesia viewed things. They were a white supremacist or body of colonial settlers who had viewed the natives with immense suspicion, viewed them as being essentially a kind of a body of peasants to do hard manual work, and viewed themselves as entitled to the wealth of Vietnam. So it's not that it's not to view really the returning French settlers in a particularly sympathetic light at all. And they were when the government in Paris in the mid to late 1940s was looking at a way of creating a compromise or dominion status within Vietnam. It was the settlers that put their political efforts into destroying any and every compromise. There was plenty of room for compromise from the Vietminh, who considered dominion status within the French Empire, much as, say, Canada or Australia has within the British Empire, a kind of a home rule. Why did the colonists sabotage that? Well, they sabotaged it mainly because they believed that in an upcoming war with the Vietminh, they could win, and they could win a kind of Carthaginian victory, and thus defeat any notion of independence in the future. And so they really do learn, kind of the verdict of history on that one, unfortunately for them. So it's worth one little kind of facet of all of this about it that's worth kind of exploring is what the British did. The British crossed over from Burma, and they march into Vietnam. And when they get there, they establish a brief kind of interim colonial rule, and then they put the French colonists back into power. Why did they do that? Well, they do that mainly because the British did not want a national liberation movement. British hadn't decided yet that that India was a busted flush. There was, it would take a couple more years of crises in India for them to realise that there's no holding on to India. They had not, but in late 1945, they had not given up on India at all. Perhaps there was going to be some kind of home rule, but the idea of independence was not. It was not a kind of a foregone conclusion. But what you don't want is a national independence movement on your borders that's going to cause all sorts of trouble. So your allies that you don't like very much, the French, you put them back into power because it's better to have them there than the way that the flames of nationalism fan across Asia. And to this end, what the British did was they didn't have quite enough troops to police and disarm the Vietminh, and they didn't get to disarm all of them anyway, as we've seen. So they rearmed the Japanese prisoners of war, and set them against the Vietminh, and said basically, this national uprising here that we've got, put that down, please. Some Japanese POWs actually joined with the Vietminh and thought, well, these are our fellow Asians, and we're going to fight back against Europeans, which is kind of this pan-Japanese, pan-Asian sentiment that had always kind of been there in some regard. But a lot of them obeyed their orders, and so the British were quite cynical when it came to restoring colonial order about how they did it. Anyway, that just tells us a bit of a story about France and Vietnam and Japan during the Second World War, and also about the different allied power struggles and games that are played around Vietnam, and helps us to understand a little bit about the powder keg of Vietnam that is there and waiting to be lit in 1945. Thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. They're the home of the #1 checkout on the planet and the not-so-secret Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales happening. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds and Skims use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/start selling. All lowercase. Go to shopify.com/start selling to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/start selling.